Imagine the Middle East not as, a neat row of dominoes, but as a massive Jenga tower.
Right.
But a Jenga tower that is wrapped entirely in razor wire.
Wow. Yeah, that is a vivid image.
Right, because there's this pervasive, deeply comforting expectation in geopolitics that if you just manage to pull out the most problematic block at the very bottom, the rest of the tower will simply clatter to the table in this predictable, satisfying sequence.
Neatly packing itself away.
Exactly, leaving the board completely clean so you can just build something better.
And, the illusion of sequence is incredibly powerful.
Oh, totally.
Human psychology naturally gravitates toward linear history. We inherently want bad systems to collapse neatly. We crave a clear beginning, a definitive middle, and a really satisfying end where the villain is defeated and the victory screen rolls.
Like a movie.
Like a movie. But when you apply that desire for simplicity to intractable systems, you just blind yourself to the structural realities on the ground.
Yeah.
Because when you pull the center thread out of a really complex web, the web doesn't just politely disappear.
Right, it leaves a void.
Exactly. The empty space simply invites a much more dangerous spider to move in.
Which brings us perfectly to our mission for today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are using two deeply researched, and I have to say, highly politically charged essays published on May 6, 2026, from the geopolitical blog Brockface.
They are dense reads.
Extremely dense. The pieces are titled From Regime Change to Regional Transformation and the Post-Axis Middle East. And before we take another step into this, a quick but really vital reminder for you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
Our job today is not to take a political side, endorse any specific viewpoint, or validate the ideologies of any group we mention.
Right, absolutely not.
We are talking about the United States, Israel, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and, various regional players in a time of intense real-world conflict. So we are simply here to act as your impartial guides.
Just breaking down the map.
Exactly. Breaking down the complex map the author has drawn so you can understand the arguments for yourself.
And the core premise we are dismantling today is that really alluring domino effect narrative you mentioned.
The idea that it all just falls in line.
Right. It's this idea floating around policy circles that if the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime falls, then Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen will automatically and immediately unravel.
This vanish overnight.
Leading to the sweeping wave of regional liberation. But the author strongly critiques this sequential narrative.
Because it fundamentally misunderstands what the axis of resistance actually is, right?
Exactly. The text defines this axis. So Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and various allied militias, not as a traditional alliance like NATO.
Because NATO is essentially just a treaty on a piece of paper.
Right, it's a legal agreement. But the axis is a strategic architecture that has been meticulously built over 4 decades.
And if it's an architecture, caving in the roof doesn't make the walls Danish.
No, not at all.
You're just left with heavily armed ruins. And there is this chilling Middle Eastern proverb the author cites to explain this.
Oh, the camel proverb.
Yeah. When the camel falls, the knives come out.
It's brilliant. That proverb perfectly encapsulates the mechanics of a power vacuum.
Because everyone just descends on the carcass.
Exactly. When a central dominating power, the camel, finally collapses, the resulting space isn't filled by spontaneous, peaceful democracy.
Right.
It is filled by a scramble for resources, revenge, and territorial control.
Yeah.
Vacuums historically invite localized violence, warlordism, and sectarian score settling.
Okay, wait. I'm stuck on something here. Let me just play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure, go for it.
If Iran is paying the bills for all these groups, providing the missiles, the training, the cash flow, and then Iran goes bankrupt or the regime falls, shouldn't the proxies just fold?
You'd think so, logically.
Right, like no money, no mission. If the bank closes, the business inherently fails.
But the author points out that Resti assumes these groups are mere foreign mercenaries, which is a really dangerous miscalculation.
How so?
We have to look at the concept of local entrenchment. These groups are heavily subsidized by Tehran, yes, absolutely. But they have spent decades weaving themselves into the very fabric of their local economies.
So they aren't just military outfits?
No, they run social service networks. They tap into the deep-seated historical grievances of their respective populations.
So they have a local identity?
Completely. If the bank in Tehran closes, the branch offices in Lebanon or Yemen will certainly struggle. They might lose their high-end ballistic missile supply.
Which is significant.
Very significant. But they don't just vaporize into thin air. They have local extortion rackets, shadow economies, independent taxation,
Wow. Yeah.
and ideological buy-in from specific demographics. They adapt to local survival.
So to really understand why the franchise survives, we have to look closely at the corporate headquarters.
Yes, the core.
Let's trace the historical timeline of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which forms the center of this axis. The author emphasizes that you really can't understand modern Iran without understanding the crucible of its founding.
Yeah, the timeline is everything here.
Yeah.
It begins in 1979 with a revolution that overthrew the Shah.
Establishing the theocratic system.
Right. But the true forge of the modern Iranian state was the brutal Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988.
That was a devastating conflict.
Unbelievably brutal.
Hmm.
The author argues that this specific conflict taught the regime everything it needed to know about survival.
Because they were essentially fighting alone.
Exactly. They suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, fought the world to a standstill, and emerged with this hardened, deeply paranoid identity.
And that paranoia that led directly to the creation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Yes.
They didn't just build an army, they built a parallel state.
The mechanism of the IRGC is fascinating and honestly terrifying. They institutionalize themselves not just into the military, but into the economy itself.
Right. They own real estate companies.
They own construction companies, telecommunications, ports. They became the intelligence apparatus. And then you roll the timeline forward through the brief economic relief of the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal.
Which didn't last long.
No. Directly into the 2018 return of crushing U.S. sanctions. And finally, into the unprecedented waves of domestic protests spanning from 2019 all the way to 2026.
And the text makes a really profound distinction here that completely changes how you view the country.
It really does.
The regime in Iran is not a standard dictatorship. It is a system built specifically to withstand maximum pressure.
It's an endurance machine.
Yeah, the author writes, and this stuck with me, the Islamic Republic does not govern to improve life, it governs to avoid death.
Which is a chilling way to run a country. When a state treats its own survival as its sole organizing doctrine, it behaves entirely differently than a government trying to win re-election.
Or even just a standard autocrat trying to keep people happy.
Exactly. The author notes that the regime's foundational implicit bargain with its citizens was always, sacrifice today for dignity tomorrow.
Endure the pain, though.
Right. Endure the sanctions, endure the isolation, and eventually we will be a dominant, respected regional power.
But that bargain has completely expired, especially for the youth.
Oh, it's totally gone.
The economic stagnation, the currency collapse, the brutal repression, it has completely severed any lingering attachment to the regime's legitimacy.
The protests really show that.
Yeah, the protest slogans highlighted in the text aren't asking for reform anymore. They aren't asking for cheaper bread. The streets are literally chanting, "We don't want the Islamic Republic."
That is a demand for total replacement.
But here's my question. If the underlying foundation is entirely rotted out and the populace is in open revolt, how long can a regime realistically sustain itself purely on violence and a parallel autonomy?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because we're conditioned to think that once the people turn, the clock is ticking and it's just a matter of time.
And that brings us to the author's central warning about Iran. Societal strain is not the equivalent of state collapse.
They aren't the same thing.
Not at all. The security apparatus has historically survived severe shocks because its elite class knows that if the regime falls, they don't just lose their jobs.
They lose everything.
They lose their fortunes and potentially their lives. They are fighting an existential war against their own population.
So a coercive system can just rot from the inside out for decades before it physically collapses.
Unfortunately, yes. As long as the IRGC maintains its monopoly on organized violence and internal communication, and as long as it has enough shadow economy revenue to pay its security forces, the timeline for collapse is completely unpredictable.
It could be tomorrow, it could be 20 years.
Exactly. The text urges policymakers to stop waiting for the clock to run out.
So while Iran's internal pressure builds to this slow boil without an immediate explosion, its most prominent and powerful external investment is facing its own massive crisis over in Lebanon.
Hezbollah.
Right. If Iran is the headquarters, Hezbollah is the flagship franchise.
Perfect way to put it.
And the text describes Hezbollah today as an armed shadow state.
The historical context for Hezbollah explains why they are so incredibly difficult to uproot. They emerged in 1982 during the chaos of the Lebanese Civil War and the Israeli invasion.
So they were born in a vacuum.
Completely.
Yeah.
And they built immense regional prestige by framing themselves as the sole force that compelled Israel's withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000.
Which made them heroes to a lot of people.
Huge heroes. And they survived the devastating 2006 war. They constructed this narrative of being an untarnished noble resistance.
Right.
But then, from 2011 to 2017, they made a strategic pivot that fundamentally altered their standing in the region.
They intervened in the Syrian civil war.
Yes, to save Bashar al-Assad's regime.
And to understand why that was so damaging to their legitimacy, you have to look at their branding, right?
Their entire brand.
For decades, they told the Arab world they existed solely to fight Israel. But in Syria, they were deployed by Tehran to crush fellow Arabs.
Yes, fighting to prop up a brutal dictator against a popular uprising.
So it gave them battlefield experience.
But it shattered their aura as a pure resistance movement. They became sectarian enforcers.
And then comes the real earthquake, the 2019 to 2022 Lebanese financial collapse.
One of the worst economic implosions in modern global history.
Just absolute devastation. The author argues that Hezbollah's power rests on 3 pillars: Iranian money, the resistance narrative, and the absolute political paralysis of the Lebanese state.
Which ensures no domestic force can ever challenge them.
Right. But that financial collapse exposed the illusion of their permanence.
Because they were suddenly trapped by their own success.
How so?
Because Hezbollah had embedded itself so deeply into the Lebanese parliament and ruling cabinet to protect its weapons.
Oh, I see.
They could no longer pretend to be an outsider resistance force. They were part of the ruling cartel.
So when the economy crashed, they were holding the bag.
Exactly. The text highlights a devastating quote from the massive street protests in Beirut. They all stole, but Hezbollah carried the gun.
Man, that is a staggering indictment.
It's so powerful.
It makes me think of like an incredibly heavily armed bouncer at a mob-run casino.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. For a long time, the patrons are just intimidated. They respect the muscle, they stay quiet, and they play the games.
Right.
But when the casino goes completely bankrupt, the games are exposed as totally rigged, and the patrons lose absolutely every cent to their name. They stop fearing the bouncer and start blaming him.
Yes.
Because they realize the bouncer isn't there to protect the patrons. He's there to protect the thieves in the back room.
That is exactly it. And just like that bouncer, Hezbollah can't simply walk out the front door and find another job.
They are tied to the building.
Structurally bound to the casino. They run vast networks of social services, hospitals, and schools that rely on the broader Lebanese ecosystem.
So if the money from Iran stops,
if the strategic umbrella from Tehran, the funding and weapons cracks, Hezbollah doesn't just vanish. It devolves.
Into what?
Into a localized militia, stripped of its regional heavyweight aura, forced to ruthlessly cannibalize whatever is left of the Lebanese state just to survive.
Just fighting over scraps.
Exactly.
Which brings us to another landscape defined by ruins. Just as Hezbollah is hopelessly entangled with Lebanese corruption, the text argues that Hamas is inextricably tied to the devastated physical and political landscape of Gaza.
The timeline for Hamas is really crucial for understanding the depth of their roots there.
Right. They didn't just appear overnight.
No. Founded in 1987 during the First Intifada, they built their base by vehemently rejecting the diplomatic Oslo Accords in the 1990s.
Being the hardline alternative.
Yes. But the pivotal moment comes in 2006 when they participate in and actually win the Palestinian legislative elections.
Which they won by capitalizing on widespread frustration with Fatah.
Exactly.
And just to clarify for you listening, Fatah being the more secular, rival Palestinian political faction that dominates the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which had at that point become deeply associated with corruption and stalled peace processes.
Right. So following that election in 2007, Hamas seized full unilateral control of Gaza through a violent internal conflict.
Pushing Fatah out completely.
Yes. And the text emphasizes a critical reality here. Hamas is not just a militant group hiding in subterranean tunnels.
Right, they are the government.
For nearly 2 decades, they have been a deeply entrenched bureaucracy. They are the civil service, they are the traffic cops, the tax collectors, and the municipal planners.
The author introduces a phrase here that feels honestly central to this entire deep dive. When politics fails, guns become the government.
It's a sobering truth.
Hamas is described as a symptom of a larger disease. You can't surgically extract an organization that has become the governing authority without addressing the underlying hopelessness and failed diplomacy that allowed them to take root in the first place.
And the mechanism of a vacuum in Gaza is particularly dangerous. The text argues that the idea of Hamas simply collapsing and Gaza instantly experiencing liberation is a geopolitical fantasy.
A total fantasy.
If the governing structure is destroyed without a highly organized, legitimate political alternative ready to immediately take the reins, the territory becomes a chaotic battlefield for rival clan warlords, criminal syndicates, or even more radicalized splinter factions.
So removing the group is a governance replacement problem, not just a battlefield problem.
Yes, exactly. You can win a total military victory, but if you don't own the recovery, you just own the chaos.
But practically speaking, I mean, how do you inject moderate politics back into a landscape that has been physically leveled and socially traumatized?
It's incredibly difficult.
Because if you are a citizen living in absolute rubble, watching your infrastructure completely evaporate, where does a legitimate political alternative even come from?
That is the bleak reality the text confronts. Ruins breed radicalization.
Always.
Without a massive, historically unprecedented structural intervention that provides immediate security, functioning civil services, and undeniable economic hope.
People will just turn to whoever has power.
Exactly. A traumatized population will inevitably gravitate toward whichever armed actor can provide a loaf of bread and basic physical protection.
Okay, so untangling a deeply rooted armed group from local grievances is incredibly difficult in Lebanon and Gaza. But the author suggests it is perhaps most complex in Yemen,
Oh, Yemen is incredibly complicated.
where the conflict routinely defies every simple narrative Western policymakers try to project onto it. So let's look at the Houthis.
Right. In international headlines, the Houthis are frequently reduced to shorthand as just a mere Iranian proxy.
Which is easy to say.
But the text makes a compelling case that this framing is historically illiterate. To understand them, you have to look back to the 1990s.
Decades ago.
Yes. The movement originated among Zaidi Shia communities
Mhm.
in the mountainous northern regions of Yemen.
And it's important to define that because Zaidi Shia Islam is a unique branch primarily found in Yemen, and it is fundamentally distinct from the Twelver Shiism that is the state religion of Iran.
Very distinct. The ideological connection is actually quite loose. The Houthis fought a series of brutal domestic wars against the central Yemeni government between 2004 and 2010.
So they were fighting long before the current proxy war.
Long before the regional proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran escalated. When the Houthis seized the capital, Sana'a, in 2014, they were capitalizing on domestic chaos.
Not executing some master plan drawn up in Tehran.
Exactly.
But since then, they've evolved into a major regional security actor. I mean, with sophisticated drones and ballistic missiles disrupting global shipping.
True, but the author stresses that they still have deep local roots and highly localized grievances. The war in Yemen is not one unified conflict.
What is it then?
It is a shattered political architecture involving tribal, regional, sectarian, and geopolitical layers, all overlapping each other.
So Iranian support just acts as an accelerant.
Yes, exactly. It makes the Houthis vastly more lethal and capable of projecting power across the Red Sea. But Iran did not invent their cause.
There is a profound Yemeni lament included in the text that really cuts through all the geopolitical noise.
Which one?
We don't know who rules us, but we know we are hungry.
Oh, yeah. That is devastating.
It really brings the geopolitics right down to the human level. It tells us that liberation in Yemen cannot just mean military defeat for the Houthis.
No, you can't just bomb away one faction.
Right, and expect a country that has fractured into half a dozen warlord fiefdoms to magically stitch itself back into a functioning state. It requires addressing famine, national unity, and state reconstruction.
Because if you just remove the Houthis without rebuilding the state, another militia immediately seizes the capital.
Like clockwork. Okay, so with the complex realities of these four actors established, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, what actually happens if the structure cracks?
This is where the author lays out four distinct scenario plans.
And this is where the global implications really come into focus for us.
Right. So scenario one is the chain reaction collapse.
The domino effect.
Exactly. This is the highly sought-after domino effect. Under massive economic or military pressure, Iran weakens dramatically, its funding dries up entirely, and Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis rapidly unravel without logistical support.
But the text warns this carries an astronomical risk,
A huge risk.
because this is exactly what many policymakers mistakenly call liberation, but the historical reality is that it leads straight to warlordism. If all these structures collapse simultaneously, the resulting regional vacuum would be catastrophic.
It would be a nightmare. Which leads to scenario 2.
Okay.
Iran survives, proxies evolve. In this future, Iran manages to adapt to the pressure. It shifts away from extremely costly direct proxy wars toward smarter diplomacy.
So they back off a bit.
Right. And the proxies themselves become more autonomous, focusing on local survival rather than regional coordination.
But the danger there is that the underlying conflicts never actually resolve.
Right. It just degrades into a chronic, low-intensity disease, a permanent, simmering state of instability.
Nobody wins, nobody fully loses.
Exactly. Then we have scenario 3. Proxies fall first, Iran retreats.
How does that work?
In this outcome, Hezbollah and Hamas are militarily degraded to the point of irrelevance, and the Houthis are contained. Iran itself remains internally stable, but it completely loses its external reach and forward defense architecture.
So let's play out the game theory on that one. If Iran loses all its regional leverage and becomes entirely isolated, almost like a Middle Eastern North Korea, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Do they just quietly accept defeat?
Historically, isolated regimes do not go quietly.
Never.
The text warns that a cornered, North Korea-style Iran would adopt a deeply defensive but highly unpredictable posture.
Lashing out.
Yeah, without their proxy militias to act as a deterrent against an attack from Israel or the U.S., they are highly likely to escalate in asymmetric ways.
Like what?
Most notably, by accelerating their nuclear program to the threshold of a weapon to restore their lost security guarantee.
Which could radically destabilize global oil markets as the Persian Gulf becomes hyper-militarized.
Exactly. Which brings us to scenario 4, grand bargain diplomacy.
The ideal outcome.
The author calls this the least dramatic, but overwhelmingly most sustainable path. It involves a negotiated regional settlement where the U.S., the Gulf states, Israel, and Iran enter comprehensive negotiations.
Everything on the table.
Everything. Hezbollah is incentivized to disarm and become purely a political party. Hamas is replaced by a technocratic governance structure, and the Houthis are integrated into a federal Yemeni political settlement,
Replacing armed conflict with institutional governance.
which is the only proven way to permanently end a war.
But, I mean, the author openly admits this grand bargain depends entirely on trust, verifiable enforcement mechanisms, and mutual compromise.
Which are in short supply.
Let's be real. Those concepts are historically practically non-existent in this region. The very actors you need to sit at the table are currently shooting at each other. Isn't this scenario just geopolitical wishful thinking?
I mean, it requires an almost impossible alignment of political will. But the author's argument is analytical, not optimistic. They are simply pointing out that the grand bargain is the only scenario that leads to long-term stability.
By process of elimination.
Yes. The other 3 scenarios inevitably lead to either a massive power vacuum, permanent low-intensity warfare, or nuclear brinkmanship.
And if the axis falls without that grand bargain in place, we run headfirst into a terrifying historical pattern. Which brings us to the concept of the vacuum theory.
Yes.
And redefining what liberation actually means.
Because the historical track record in the Middle East over the last 2 decades is unforgiving.
Let's talk about Iraq.
The author details the mechanism of these vacuums perfectly.
Yeah.
In Iraq, a brutal dictator was removed by external force.
Saddam Hussein.
Right. But the state infrastructure was simultaneously dismantled, leading directly to a sectarian civil war and providing the incubator for the rise of ISIS.
We mentioned Libya earlier, too. Explain the mechanics of how that vacuum operated. Why didn't democracy flourish when Gaddafi fell?
Because Gaddafi had purposely designed the Libyan state to have 0 independent institutions.
It was a one-man show?
Exactly. He centralized all authority, military command, and economic distribution within his own inner circle to prevent any rivals from organizing.
So when he died...
When he was overthrown, he took the entire state apparatus with him. There were no independent courts, no civil service, and no national army left standing.
So the people just inherited a void.
The citizens didn't inherit a government, they inherited a vast arsenal of weapons.
It's a deadly combination.
Local militias suddenly realized that whoever had the biggest guns was the new mayor, and the country fractured violently along tribal lines.
It perfectly illustrates the central lesson of the text. It is easier to destroy a regime than to build a stable replacement.
Much easier.
Everyone focuses entirely on the question, will Iran fall? But the author insists the only question that matters is, what fills Iran, or Gaza, or Lebanon?
True liberation cannot simply be defined as the collapse of the bad guys.
Right. According to the source, liberation must be rigorously defined as functional governance, accountable institutions, economic opportunity, and security under the rule of law.
And the author actually maps out what true liberation requires for each specific place.
Let's go through them.
For Iran, it's not just getting a new face on the television. It requires a massive constitutional transition, imposing strict civilian control over a demilitarized IRGC and painful economic reintegration into global markets.
And for Lebanon?
For Lebanon, it means the state finally achieving a true monopoly of force. No more armed militias operating outside the law, blackmailing the central government, and completely dismantling the corrupt sectarian political quota system.
And Gaza.
For Gaza, liberation means tens of billions in massive reconstruction funding, establishing open economic corridors and building an alternative governing authority that can actually provide life, opportunity, and stability, rather than relying on a narrative of perpetual martyrdom.
And finally, Yemen.
For Yemen, it means forging a fragile national unity, demobilizing massive regional militias, and rebuilding an agricultural economy from scratch.
Honestly, it's like staring at a massive condemned apartment building filled with asbestos.
Okay.
Every single person in the neighborhood agrees the building is toxic and needs to go.
Right.
But you decide to dynamite the building without having any blueprints for a new one, without securing any construction funding, and without buying any new materials.
What happens?
The residents don't magically get a shiny new home. They just end up living in the toxic rubble of the old one, completely exposed to the elements.
And historically, the people who thrive in the rubble are the most ruthless, violent actors. A revolution without immediate, robust institution building is merely a transfer of violence from one group to another.
So this pivots us directly into the second major essay we're analyzing today.
The post-Axis Middle East.
Right, because if the axis does fall and a massive region-wide vacuum opens up, who actually has the blueprints, the money, and the materials to build on all that rubble?
The second essay argues a very sobering point. The post-Axis Middle East will not automatically be a peaceful region.
It's not going to be some utopia.
No. It will immediately transform into a multipolar struggle for influence among rising powers.
The text includes a quote from a seasoned diplomat that acts as the thesis for this section. The Middle East does not eliminate conflicts, it changes sponsors.
It changes sponsors.
That is such a cynical yet entirely accurate way to view geopolitics.
It really is.
And, if you're listening to this from the United States or Europe, you might be wondering why you should care who the new sponsors are, or why you should care who rebuilds a port in Yemen or a highway in Syria.
But you definitely should care.
Absolutely, because the country that lays the concrete dictates the global supply chains you rely on every day.
They control the flow of energy.
The shipping routes for your consumer goods.
Yeah.
And the security environment that dictates whether another massive refugee crisis spills over into Western politics.
Which is exactly why this transition matters globally.
So let's dive into the players. The text dives into the two massive economic players currently rising to fill the void. First, Saudi Arabia.
Which the author labels the banker. Saudi Arabia is currently undergoing a massive historic strategic evolution. They are purposefully shifting away from their traditional role as a conservative, oil-rich status quo power that relied entirely on U.S. military protection.
Right, they want to step out of that shadow.
They now want to be the ambitious, independent geopolitical architect of the region, and they are using their sovereign wealth fund as their primary weapon.
The author provides an incredible contrast to highlight this shift. Iran exports militias. Saudi Arabia exports contracts.
Contracts, exactly. If the Iranian network retreats, Saudi Arabia plans to aggressively use its wealth to buy stability and dominant influence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen.
They want to win the region through massive infrastructure development.
Investment and economic integration, completely replacing the ideology of resistance with the ideology of commerce.
And right alongside them, you have the United Arab Emirates, which the text refers to as the merchant empire.
A merchant empire. The UAE's strategy for power projection is fascinating because it is so quiet, logistical, and relentlessly focused on geography.
They aren't trying to build massive ideological movements.
No, they are building an empire of dependency through hard infrastructure. They are systematically securing control over commercial ports, vital shipping corridors, and massive trade hubs in the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa, and southern Yemen.
The defining quote for the UAE in the text is, "The UAE doesn't conquer countries, it buys their coastlines."
It is a brilliant, almost corporate approach to geopolitics.
But let me push back on this entire banker and merchant strategy for a second.
Okay.
The author notes a major glaring constraint for both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. Pouring billions into these fractured countries might easily be perceived by the local populations as blatant neocolonialism.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you really buy political legitimacy with shipping containers in a region that is fundamentally driven by deep historical, religious, and ideological grievances?
That is the greatest vulnerability of the Gulf strategy.
Yeah.
You can buy a commercial port, but you cannot buy the loyalty of the impoverished citizens living in the slums around that port.
Right. They might just resent you.
If Saudi or Emirati investments are perceived merely as elite corruption or as foreign domination designed to extract resources while ignoring local suffering, it will inevitably trigger a massive grassroots backlash.
Economic development has to be paired with local political dignity, or it will fail.
Yes.
So if Saudi Arabia and the UAE are trying to buy influence with checkbooks and concrete, it creates an opening for other players who project power entirely differently.
Through military force, ideological alignment, or diplomatic leverage.
Which brings us to the next tier of competitors trying to manage the vacuum: the balancers, mediators, and architects.
The first critical player in this tier is Turkey.
Described as the neo-Ottoman balancer.
Yes. Turkey is an incredibly potent hybrid power. They sit precisely at the intersection of Europe and the Middle East, possessing massive NATO military infrastructure, a strong Islamic political identity that resonates with Sunni populations, and a highly diversified, booming industrial economy.
The text notes, Iran speaks revolution, Turkey speaks power.
Which is very telling.
If the Iranian Shia crescent weakens, Turkey is perfectly positioned to rapidly expand its influence southward into northern Syria, Iraq, and throughout the Levant, utilizing deep networks of political Islam that the Gulf states distrust.
Then you look at Qatar.
Qatar's an interesting one.
Qatar's power projection is the exact opposite of Turkey's. It is almost entirely non-military.
They are the soft power megaphone.
Yes. They project influence globally through the Al Jazeera media network, through astronomical natural gas wealth, and by carefully cultivating a reputation as the region's indispensable diplomatic mediator.
The author describes Qatar perfectly: small enough to be trusted and rich enough to be useful.
I love that quote.
I read that and instantly thought of Qatar as the human resources department during a highly toxic corporate merger.
The HR department.
Yeah, think about it. Everyone secretly resents them. They are inappropriately involved in everyone's private business, and they hold completely contradictory alliances.
Right.
But literally nobody can negotiate the severance packages, release the hostages, or sign the new contracts without them sitting at the head of the table.
Okay, that is spot on. And to build on that HR analogy, Qatar knows exactly where all the bodies are buried.
Exactly.
They host American military bases while simultaneously hosting leaders of Hamas and the Taliban.
They play all sides.
They thrive in fractured, broken systems, precisely because a fractured system desperately requires a broker who can speak to all sides.
And then maneuvering amidst all of these players is Israel.
Yes. The text proposes a fascinating shift for Israel.
It suggests that in a post-Axis world, freed from the constant existential threat of a multi-front Iranian proxy war, Israel has a fleeting opportunity to shift from being a besieged fortress to acting as a genuine regional system builder.
Because technologically and economically, Israel is primed for this.
Absolutely.
They could become the central, integrating node for regional innovation, advanced trade corridors connecting the Mediterranean to the Gulf, and integrated missile and drone defense networks alongside Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
But the author highlights a massive, glaring constraint for Israel that just cannot be ignored.
The political constraint.
The text states very clearly, Israel can win tactical military wars forever, but it cannot win true regional legitimacy or become a real architect of the Middle East without a comprehensive political settlement with the Palestinians.
The Palestinian issue is the unresolved emotional, political, and moral core of the entire region.
You can't just pave over it.
No, you can't. The author argues that without a credible, tangible political horizon for Palestinian statehood or rights, any overarching regional architecture Israel attempts to build with Arab capitals will remain inherently fragile.
Because it would be deeply unpopular on the Arab street.
and constantly vulnerable to sudden radicalization.
Okay, so we have the bankers writing the checks, the merchants buying the ports, the balancers moving troops, and the architects designing trade routes.
They're all hovering above the region, maneuvering for ultimate influence.
But who actually holds the physical ground where all this fierce competition will take place? Let's examine the geographically bound states, the gatekeepers, the pillar, and the prizes.
The text unpacks the deeply compromised roles of the states that are physically trapped by their geography, starting with Egypt.
The gatekeeper of Gaza.
Exactly. Because they control the physical southern border, the critical Sinai security zone, and the global choke point of the Suez Canal, they have massive geographic leverage.
But the intelligence phrase the author uses for Egypt is incredibly telling. Too big to ignore and too fragile to rely on.
Yeah.
They are structurally essential for whatever post-Hamas reality emerges in Gaza, but their capacity to project power is totally crippled by devastating internal economic crises, massive debt, and a bloated military economy.
Then there's Jordan, characterized as the silent pillar of stability.
Jordan is fascinating here.
Jordan's entire national strategy is focused on survival through risk avoidance. They are deeply trusted by Western intelligence agencies, heavily reliant on financial aid from the Gulf, and intimately tied to Palestinian demographics.
They just try to keep their head down.
If a regional settlement ever occurs, Jordan would be the central logistical hub for refugee management and cross-border security cooperation.
Wait, let me challenge that strategy for a second.
Sure.
Jordan's entire mechanism for survival is standing incredibly still and avoiding bold action to maintain stability.
Right.
But in a post-Axis free-for-all, where everyone from Turkey to the UAE is aggressively redrawing the map and grabbing resources, is playing it safe actually a sustainable survival mechanism? Or is it just a way of quietly delaying an inevitable crisis?
It is a huge gamble.
If you stand perfectly still on a battlefield while everyone else is aggressively maneuvering, don't you eventually just get run over?
That is exactly the existential dread keeping policymakers in Amman awake at night. If the entire region completely reorders its economic and security architecture, simply being the quiet, reliable buffer state might not be enough to attract the investment needed to protect their fragile economy.
Or maintain their sovereignty against more aggressive neighbors.
Exactly. And then we arrive at the absolute geopolitical tragedy of this entire analysis: Iraq and Syria.
The text bleakly refers to them as the grand prizes.
These two nations are fractured, resource-rich, and hold the most vital strategic geography in the Middle East.
So if Iran's suffocating grip loosens,
These nations will instantly become the primary battlegrounds, where all the new rising powers, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE, will fiercely compete for dominance and access.
the tragedy is that even in a post-Axis world, the text implies they aren't truly liberated. They are just destined to be carved up by a new, wealthier set of sponsors.
There's a quote the author pulls from the Iraqi youth protests that just breaks your heart. "We want a homeland, not a battlefield."
It perfectly captures the profound exhaustion of an entire generation of citizens who have realized their sovereign country is viewed by the rest of the world merely as a chessboard for other nations to play their geopolitical games.
It's devastating.
Finally, we need to pull the lens all the way out to observe the global heavyweights and the terrifying dark horses waiting in the wings to exploit the transition.
The superpowers.
How do the superpowers interact with this massive, unfolding regional vacuum?
Well, the author describes the United States as the invisible architect. Washington is undergoing a profound, multi-administration shift away from the era of massive, boots-on-the-ground troop deployments and nation-building.
We aren't doing the Iraq invasion playbook anymore.
No. The new strategy relies heavily on over-the-horizon deterrence, targeted economic sanctions, arming regional allies, and massive intelligence sharing.
The quote that defines the American posture is beautifully concise. We can't quit the Middle East, but we can't afford to live there.
That sums it up perfectly. Then there is China, the rising economic superpower.
And their approach is totally different.
Fundamentally different from America's. They do not care about ideological transformation, democratic values, or who is currently in charge of the government.
They just want to do business.
They care exclusively about securing oil stability, gaining access to deep water ports, and integrating the region into their massive Belt and Road Initiative.
Just to quickly clarify that concept for you, the Belt and Road Initiative is China's massive, trillion-dollar global infrastructure development strategy designed to invest in nearly 150 countries to create land and maritime trade routes that lead directly back to Beijing.
The text summarizes the contrast between the U.S. and China perfectly. America asks who should rule you. China asks who will sign the contract.
It is a purely transactional, highly effective approach.
Very effective. Then you have Russia, which the text views not as a builder, but as a declining spoiler.
Because they don't have the money to build.
Exactly. Because Russia lacks the vast economic capacity of China or the Gulf states to actually fund the rebuilding of the new Middle East, their strategy is simply to sabotage the builders.
They just want to break things.
They want to maintain enough chaos to prevent Western-aligned unity and keep global energy prices artificially high.
And we cannot ignore the dark horses. The author warns that if state collapse accelerates during this transition, the resulting vacuums will empower highly organized criminal networks dealing in narcotics, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking.
And even worse, an ISIS-style resurgence.
Right.
They may have been defeated territorially, but chaos and ungoverned spaces are their oxygen.
This complex interplay of superpowers and dark horses leads to the author's most critical conceptual warning: reconstruction as power.
This is key.
The author argues that in the 21st century, dispensing reconstruction money is a modern form of conquest.
Whoever rebuilds the electrical grids in Gaza, or the financial sector in Lebanon, or the highways in Syria, essentially owns their future politics,
Their telecommunications networks.
and their geopolitical alignment.
It paints such a vivid, chaotic picture. It's like America is the exhausted referee blowing the whistle from the sidelines, desperately trying to keep the game orderly.
Okay, I see where you're going.
China is the vendor calmly walking through the stands, selling highly overpriced concessions to whoever has cash. Russia is the angry fan intentionally throwing trash onto the field just to disrupt the momentum.
And ISIS.
ISIS is hiding under the bleachers, quietly waiting for the stadium lights to go out so they can swarm the field.
That is a dark but structurally very accurate visualization of how these actors operate in relation to the vacuum.
So, knowing all of this, the sheer catastrophic danger of power vacuums, the self-interested maneuvering of the bankers and merchants, the dark horses waiting for the lights to go out, how does the world prevent the post-Axis era from simply becoming a brand new, highly funded layer of hell?
We need a plan.
Let's dive deep into the author's policy playbook.
The author lays out 6 highly specific, challenging policy recommendations for the international community.
Okay, hit me.
First, fundamentally stop treating regime collapse as a strategy in itself. It is a tactical event, not a strategic solution.
Like we've been saying, what comes after?
Exactly. Second, prepare for Iran's eventual political transition without actively trying to engineer it from the outside.
Meaning what?
Meaning, support civil society, ensure communications remain open, and target sanctions surgically at the elite IRGC leadership, not at basic civilian medicine and food.
That makes sense.
Third, they argue we must systematically separate Hezbollah from the Lebanese people by conditioning all international bailout aid on deep, verifiable institutional reform.
Yes.
Let's dig into the mechanisms of that. What does conditioning aid actually look like on the ground, and why is it so hard?
On the ground, it means the IMF and Western donors refuse to hand over a single dollar to the Lebanese central bank until the government submits to independent forensic audits, establishes a truly independent judiciary, and dismantles the corrupt customs systems at the ports.
So no free checks?
No free checks. The historical hurdle, though, is that the Lebanese political elite would rather watch their citizens starve than surrender their illicit revenue streams to international auditors.
It requires immense, unified international resolve to force them to break.
So what's the fourth recommendation?
The fourth recommendation is a massive, internationally administered Marshall Plan for Gaza.
But again, you emphasized a crucial point when we were discussing this earlier. The money must be tied to institution building.
Yes. The author vehemently warns that without establishing transparent institutions, first functioning courts, clean banking systems, strict anti-corruption enforcement, flooding a fractured, desperate territory with tens of billions in reconstruction money, just creates a corruption festival.
A corruption festival.
It empowers local warlords who siphon off the funds and completely alienates the population all over again, fueling the next cycle of radicalism.
Makes total sense. The fifth recommendation is prioritizing aggressive diplomacy and federal political settlements over continuing endless airstrikes in Yemen.
And the sixth is arguably the most ambitious: building a comprehensive regional security architecture.
What does that look like?
A permanent diplomatic forum that includes the Gulf states, Israel, Egypt, and eventually a post-crisis Iran, designed to manage disputes, share resources, and prevent issues before they escalate into proxy wars.
But looming over all these rational policy steps is a terrifying wild card the author mentions regarding the transition period.
The nuclear deterrent.
Right. If Iran's conventional proxy network of militias systematically weakens, the regime in Tehran will feel incredibly naked and vulnerable to regime change.
And if they feel vulnerable, they might decide to accelerate their nuclear weapons ambitions as a final, desperate shield, making the short-term situation unbelievably dangerous.
It's the ultimate geopolitical paradox. Weakening the axis to bring peace might actually provoke the core regime to lash out in the most apocalyptic way possible just to guarantee its own survival.
It requires an incredibly delicate balance of pressure and diplomatic off-ramps to prevent that specific escalation.
But let me challenge the author's overarching premise for these recommendations.
Go for it.
They insist we need to build a unified, cooperative reconstruction coalition immediately to prevent a chaotic scramble.
Right.
But how on earth do you align the United States, Europe, the Gulf states, and China into a single coalition when, as the text just spent thousands of words establishing, they all view reconstruction as their own personal form of geopolitical conquest?
It's a huge contradiction.
You are essentially asking rival empires to hold hands and happily share the spoils.
It exposes the central, enduring flaw in human geopolitics. Rational cooperation is the only logical way to prevent total chaos and mutually assured destruction.
But
the instinct for state self-interest and dominance almost always overrides logic. The author is presenting the necessary path to avoid disaster, even while acknowledging it is the most politically difficult one to actually walk.
So let's take a breath and recap the incredible journey we've been on today.
It's been a lot of ground to cover.
We started by examining the romantic, deeply appealing myth of the domino effect. The simplistic idea that knocking over the bad guys automatically creates freedom and democracy.
The clean slate myth.
Right. But by stepping through the complex realities of Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen, we've realized that in the Middle East, liberation isn't about who falls.
No, it is entirely about who is ready, willing, and structurally able to build what comes next.
We've learned that vacuums are the most dangerous force on Earth, and that the incoming sponsors the bankers with their contracts, the merchants buying coastlines, the architects designing tech corridors are already playing a high-stakes, multi-generational game of economic and logistical chess to own the rubble.
It is a profound and sobering reality check. The real battle for the future of the region doesn't end when the statues fall. That is exactly when the real battle begins.
Exactly. But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Okay, let's hear it.
The author's brilliant analysis focuses almost entirely on traditional power structures, nation-states, physical deep-water ports, military infrastructure, and billions in sovereign reconstruction dollars.
Right, the usual suspects.
But as we move deeper into the 2020s and beyond, what if the ultimate vacuum filler isn't a state actor at all?
Wait, how do you mean not a state actor?
Well, think about the nature of a failed state. The
Yeah.
physical infrastructure is completely destroyed, and the population's trust in centralized traditional authority is absolute zero.
Sure.
In that environment of total collapse, what if decentralized technologies step in faster than the UN or the Gulf states?
Oh, interesting.
What if cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance networks become the default economy for citizens completely cut off from global banking?
Bypassing the state entirely.
Exactly. What if AI-driven, decentralized, autonomous organizations begin to provide the identity verification, the microlending, and the social organization that corrupt, broken governments can no longer supply?
That is a wild thought.
Are we spending all our time and energy preparing for a post-Axis Middle East, mapping out the state actors only to be completely blindsided by a post-state Middle East?
Wow.
A reality where the dense web isn't controlled by a single spider in a capital city, but by a decentralized algorithm?
That is a vastly disruptive question. If technology can provide governance where states have failed, it rewrites the entire definition of power we discussed today.
Something to think about. We want to thank you so much for investing your time and joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the Barak Face essays.
It's a heavy topic, but so essential.
Essential to grasp. Keep questioning the simple narratives. Remember that when you pull a single thread, the entire web shakes. And we will see you next time.